The reading today is from Romans 13, 11 through 14. And now, consider this. You know well the times you are living in. It is time for you to wake up and see what is right before your eyes, for salvation is nearer to us now than when we first believed. The darkness of the night is dissolving as dawn's light draws near. So walk out on your old dark life and put on the armor of life. May we all act as good and respectable people, living today the same way as we will in the day of his coming. Do not fall into patterns of dark living, wild partying, drunkenness, sexual depravity, decadent gratification, quarreling, and jealousy. Instead, wrap yourselves in the Lord Jesus, God's anointed, and do not fuel your sinful imagination by indulging your self-seeking desire for the pleasures of the flesh.
Yeah, Merry Christmas. I mean, gosh. I just canceled 3 of my plans for the holiday. If Mary were a young girl in our congregation, she would be in her last trimester right now. The news would be old. We would have talked about it. We would have drawn our own judgments. We would have drawn our own conclusions. We would have heard the stories. Certainly by summertime, we all would have known. Perhaps some of us would be surrounding Mary at this moment, and some of us would be keeping our distance. Mary would be preparing herself for the birth of her first child in a great deal of uncertainty. Remember, it was all the way back in March, on the first day of spring, that we recognized the gift of the Holy Spirit, even before Mary knew. We knew that on that first day of spring, the seed was being planted. And so now we have been through all of the spring and its storms and its winds and rains, and we have been through the planting season. We have been through the summer and its heat. We have harvested in the fall. We have stored away, hopefully, for the winter. We prepare ourselves for the longest night of the year coming very soon, December the 21st to be exact. But look up. As the gospel writer, as the epistle writer today points out, look up, because the longest night will soon be over. In fact, he says, because of Jesus, the longest night has passed, because you see, Mary has brought hope into the world. That we are nearer now to salvation than we have ever been before. If all that other language in there trips you up, and I don't want it to. I really don't want it to. It's not a text about touch not, taste not. It's none of that. As a matter of fact, the text begins with a simple saying, you know very well what time it is. You don't need to be reminded. Isn't that always the case when we are venturing down a path that is not really the best path for us to take? Don't we know from the very first step that we are tempting everything that keeps us from flying apart? But no, this is not a text about that. This is a text about hope, because the longest night has passed in terms of your salvation. God has come and lived among us. Because God has been one of us, God dwells in all of us and among us now. The reality is here. Salvation is nearer today than when you first believed, even if you believed an hour ago. What a great message of hope. I love this time of year. I couldn't wait for Advent. I mean, I was up here yesterday redecorating and enjoying it, and I like getting presents, don't you? Whoa, something went wrong with that. Terribly wrong. Okay, I'll let you out in a minute. Yeah, don't worry. There's a hole in there. I want to start with this little piece that I read every year. because we've been tracking Mary's development and Jesus' birth all year long. And so at Advent season, I typically read this, but I want to read it again. This is from St. John of the Cross. If you want, the virgin will come walking down the road pregnant with the holy and say, I need shelter for the night. Please take me inside your heart. My time is so close. And then under the roof of your soul, you will witness the sublime intimacy, the divine, the Christ, taking birth forever as she grasps your hand for help. For each of us is the midwife of God, each of us. Yes, there, under the dome of your being, does creation come into existence eternally through your womb, dear pilgrim, the sacred womb in your soul. As God grasps our arms for help, for each of us is his beloved servant, never far. If you want, the virgin will come walking down the street, pregnant with light, and sing. What is your story? We spend so much of this season reading the Jesus story. The characters, Mary and Joseph, shepherds and angels. And next week, we'll celebrate all of that here at 6:30 in the evening at our Christmas pageant. What is your story? What is the miracle of your birth? All through this season, I want you to hear from others and from yourself. You heard from Ronnie a moment ago. This is just part of my story. I am from country music radio. I'm from Ivory Soap and Old Spice aftershave. I'm from the little house on Orton Drive. I'm from the honeysuckle in the hedge bushes and the apple tree in the neighbor's backyard. I'm from big Christmas parties and Thanksgiving hunting trips. I'm from Mr. Kinney and Margaret Fay and those Roysdens. They're mean, I'm from the cleanest dressed babies on the block. And I'm from sweep all your dirt under the rug and always do your best and keep your head out of your you-know-what. I'm from church missions into the projects. I'm from the Tennessee woods, and I'm from fried fish and grits and from the calluses on a carpenter's hands. And I'm from the kneading of dough into bread, the strict gaze of a soldier's watch. I'm from Olin Mills portraits and priceless Polaroid snapshots. My life is a miracle. So I was telling my daughter on Thanksgiving, because we went to her house to share Thanksgiving in Azle, Texas. My daughter moved this year, and I'd never been to Azle, and I'd never seen her house, but there we were. And, of course, she was trying to prepare the meal and running herself crazy, and I was doing my part by watching football and showing up late and all the things that I'm supposed to do to be a good dad on Thanksgiving. And so there I sat watching her, and her kids were playing about here, and people were just scattered around the house and the property, and I thought, we're making stories. We're making new stories for these kids, but do they know the old stories? And so I took a moment to tell Heather the story about how when I was a kid that we would go hunting on Thanksgiving with the men in our family. And the family was huge. My grandparents had 6 children. My mother was number 5 out of 6. And so there were 13 grandkids in that side of the family. And we'd all get together, and my grandfather always drove a pickup truck with a homemade camper shell on the back because he could pull a tool trailer and throw tools in the back. And he also had a bed rack in the back so he could throw a sleeping bag or a mattress in there and convert it into a camper real quick. Those of you who know me know that I drive a white panel van that hauls music equipment during the week and converts rather nicely into a camping vehicle on the weekend. Do you see how important it is for my daughter to know about Granddaddy's truck? Do you understand how my uncles imitated my grandfather and I just sort of do the same thing? I'm a van guy. Granddad was a pickup guy, And so there we would all get all the little kids and the grandkids in the back of the pickup truck, and the men would get in the front and drive other vehicles, and they would throw all the dogs in the back with us. And, of course, we're going to drive for an hour, hour and a half at 4 o'clock in the morning on Thanksgiving morning. The dogs are going to get sick before you get where you're going. But that was okay. All the kids are in the back with the dogs getting sick. And we get there and we go rabbit hunting. Now, if you're too young for a gun, if you're under 10, maybe 12 years of age, depending on how fast you mature, you don't get a shotgun until then. So what you get as a little kid is you get these hunting pants with leather chaps sewed into them, and a little hunting jacket with leather sleeves sewed into it, and a little cap. And so Granddad, who has these really expensive rabbit dogs, says, you kids get over there in those leathers and stomp out the briar bushes and chase those rabbits out of there. And I'm like, Granddad, why can't the dogs do that? Son, I'm not sending my dogs into that briar patch. Well, the briars didn't bother me with all the leather on. I was just afraid that somebody was going to shoot me if they saw a rabbit and got too happy. But, it was a great day. It was a rite of passage when you turned 10 or 12 years old and Granddad presented you with your first shotgun. You knew when you got that shotgun that you were not going to have to stomp out any more briar bushes and chase any more rabbits out of the brambles anymore, okay? It was a great day. But we would all go on Thanksgiving, and all of the men, I'm sorry for the sexist way the story plays out, but all the men would go hunting, all the women would stay at grandmother's house, and they would all prepare the meal. And we would come home, and the first task after hunting is to skin all the rabbits. And so all the boys and men are outside skinning the rabbits, and then after that's over, we all go in and wash up and pray and have a great Thanksgiving feast and watch football on one of 2 channels that you can get in the mountains. It's a great tradition. Oh, man, I loved it. I wanted to pass that on to my daughter because what I want to talk about all this season is what's your story? What's my story? My story is that my grandmother raised 6 children, and the youngest of those was 18 years old, my Uncle Ray, when my mother got pregnant. And my mother had not met my father at the time that she got pregnant with me. And don't think that that's weird. It's in Tennessee. It can happen that way in Tennessee. And so my mother brought home this little baby to live with Granny and Granddaddy. And she worked. Mama went to work. And so my grandmother, who had raised 2 sisters because of her mother's untimely death, and then got married and raised 6 children of her own, and saw the last one turn 18, and I'm sure wondering what in the world was she going to do with the rest of her life. And then all of a sudden my mother shows up with this brand new little baby boy who needed somebody to look after him. It was possibly the worst of all situations, except for the fact that my grandmother was this very gentle and experienced and patient mother. Now, that may not be the way her older children describe her, you understand. My older kids tell a different story about me than my younger kids do. But that's who she was to me. She was perfect. And my grandfather became my very best friend. He died when I was 18. And my grandmother lived 20 more years alone, and sometimes I stayed with her at different times. Like in 1983, I took my rock and roll band to Tennessee. We were good Texas boys, and we knew that there weren't any record label guys driving through Abilene, Texas looking for new heavy metal bands to sign, so we thought, well, we ought to go to Los Angeles, and then we thought, wow, we'd get eaten if we go there. And we ought to go to New York, but if we can't survive L.A., we got no prayer in New York. So we'll just go to Nashville because that's closer to home. And, yeah, there's a lot of great heavy metal acts coming out of Nashville, especially in the 80s. Well, we didn't really make it to Nashville. We went to East Tennessee in the mountains where I grew up because we thought we'd sort of get our legs under us and work our way into Nashville. It didn't really work out that way. But during that time, I I became unemployed, and man, I had all these holes in my pants. All of my pants had holes in them, and all my shirts had holes in them. And I hadn't had a haircut, nothing unusual about that, except I looked pretty unemployable. And we got down on our luck, and so some of the guys were holed up in a trailer, and I would go to my grandmother's house occasionally, and I'd stay with her during the week, and I'd get out and I would walk all over Maryville, Tennessee looking for a job because I seriously wanted to go to work. I just wasn't that employable. But every day I'd go out and work. Well, my grandmother, she got lonely, and she really loved having people there, and she loved having me there because I was her favorite. Did I mention that? I was my granny's favorite. I absolutely was. And so she would get up every morning, and my grandmother would make breakfast, and she'd get you out of bed with breakfast already on the table, and you go sit down, and you're eating, and it's like, I can't even get breakfast finished before she's asking me, now, what do you want for dinner tonight? I'm like, well, I want to finish these eggs first, Granny. And she would always ask that question. And one day she was asking me, what do you want for dinner? And I said, I don't know. But I said, you know what I have been thinking about, Granny? I've been thinking about those Thanksgiving days and how we used to all go hunting and how we'd come home and there would be these great big meals on the table. And you used to make these blackberry cobblers. And you used to make them in this big old blue bowl. And I remember those blackberry cobblers in that giant blue bowl. They were always my favorite. Whatever happened to that blue bowl? And my granny said, well, son, I don't know. Haven't thought about that blue bowl in many, many years. And so I went out looking for a job, just like I always did. And I walked all over Maryville, and I came home that evening about 6 o'clock, just like I always did. And dinner was on the table, just like it always was, except on this day, something was different. Because you see, when I looked at the middle of the table, there was that great big bowl. And it was sitting there with a big blackberry cobbler in it. I mean to tell you, it was full up to here. And you could see the golden crust rising up above the top of the bowl, and the light would just dance off of the sugar crystals on top of that cobbler. In 1997, when my grandmother drew ill, and it was clear that she was dying, my mother asked me, she said, son, you need to come home as soon as you can. And before you get here, I want to know, is there anything in the house that you want? Because we know grandmother's going to pass away, and there will be an estate sale, but if there's any memento you want or anything in the house that you want to lay claim to before the estate sale, this would be the time. And I said, Mama, if you can go in there and look in the cabinet, somewhere in there, there's this big blue bowl. And Granny used to make cobblers in it. And I said, I've got a really cool story about one day when I went looking for work, and my grandmother made me this big old cobbler. Just me. There was nobody else coming to dinner, just me. And so Mama found me this bowl. And I've kept it put up all these years because what I want you to know is that I wasn't that good a grandson. Matter of fact, I considered her my mother, and I was an even worse son. I failed to call lots of times on her birthday, and lots of Mother's Days went by that I didn't send a card. There were even times when I borrowed money from my grandmother, and her on a fixed income handed me the money, listening to my promises, but knowing all the while I was not going to pay any of it back. And with all of that, this bowl represents how she chose to treat me. So I like to remember that with all the books I've read and with all of the retreats I've been on and all the talks I've given, and even with the fact that my mentor pointed out to me once that it's true that God came to me in a very special way, very early in my life. With all of that, I learned more about grace from my grandmother and this blue bowl than I've ever learned anywhere else. And that's such an important part of my story because in this bowl, grace is poured out to you every week. Every day when I get my phone out and I see your names in my contact list and I pray. Every day that I pull out the church directory and sit on the back row of this sanctuary and look at your names and your pictures and I pray. Oh, and please don't misunderstand me. I stopped telling God what I want and I stopped telling God what to do a very long time ago. I don't want to upset you, but even if you're ill, I rarely pray for your healing. I pray for you. God knows what you need. Oh, and you're much more happy with that than if it were up to me to know. In this bowl, mercy is poured out over you. In this bowl, my grandmother's entire life was given. Her body was broken over and over. For you. For each and every one of you. And my life is a miracle. It's a miracle. This should stay right here, don't you think? What is your story? What is your story? What angel announced your birth? And who did the angel announce it to? What miracle brought you into this world? And where have you and others in your family been broken and poured out? For the world, not for you. Not for what you can accumulate. Not for the next party. Not for all of your troubles. Remember, the darkest night has now passed, and salvation is ever closer than it has ever been. Tell your story. Tell it to me. Tell it to us. Tell it to people you work with. But take these 4 weeks of Advent and discover yourself. Discover your story and tell it. And watch angels sing. Listen for the voices of heaven to accompany you. Watch miracles happen throughout this season all about you. I mean, after all, it is the season of miracles, isn't it? All thanks be to God. Would you pray with me?